Hi, it's just after 12 noon Eastern Standard Time here on the East Coast. I'm Dan Stein. It is Wednesday, and I'm coming to you for the first time this year, and I just wanted to say welcome to 2020. Haven't had a chance to talk to you since the end of last year, and I thought it would be a good opportunity for us to have a little dialogue about some of the most important issues that are going to be facing immigration policy today. Now, I know you follow FAIR on Facebook, and I know you follow FAIR for good reasons. FAIR is your one-stop shop for high credibility analysis, breaking news, great information about the nature of the immigration crisis here in America today. And so, as we move into 2020, I have to tell you, we're going to be looking to you for comments, guidance, questions. We're going to be giving you all kinds of opportunities throughout the year to be active on all the different fronts, on social media, on our activism page, through email activism, and personal activism in your local communities. And FAIR will be there all the way through the process to help you. We've got some great events planned throughout 2020, because let's face it, 2020 is going to be a critical, pivotal, make or break year. They call it an inflection point potentially on the immigration front. I'm sure that all of you have been paying close attention to the Democratic debates. Candidates held one, in fact, just last night, their last one in Iowa. And I think everybody here probably knows that the Democrats project a position on immigration dramatically different from those of the Trump administration. Never before in the history of the country had there been such a stark choice between presidential candidates in either party. Certainly far more dramatically in contrast, and even as recently as 2016. The Democratic candidates have established a series of policy positions that amount to this. Nobody gets deported unless they commit a serious violent felony. People who come to the border and request asylum will be immediately released into the country and given work documents. There will be virtually no interior enforcement. Bernie Sanders is talking about a moratorium on all immigration enforcement. A moratorium means that nobody would be deported except the very few that the Sanders administration would say would be acceptable. Tom Steyer, is he viable? Well, he's certainly got a lot of money. Tom Steyer is saying we're going to be admitting millions and millions of climate change refugees. Well, what about our own climate change refugees? Isn't climate change going to be affecting Americans as well? But anyhow, that's his position. He's pretty much in lockstep with Bernie Sanders on the enforcement strategies. Tom Steyer has adopted some of the positions, along with Michael Bloomberg, that were articulated most recently by Beto O'Rourke, which was to remove any criminal penalty for entry without inspection along our border. Julian Castro also held that position. Most of the other candidates have various iterations of the same basic policy positions, which as they are currently articulated, amount to this: everybody stays, nobody goes home, very fast pathway to U.S. citizenship for millions and millions of people who broke our immigration laws, and giving them a future right to bring in large numbers of relatives, millions and millions more relatives, in what would arguably be the most existential change to America's makeup and our way of life in the history of the country. All this was without any kind of budgeting analysis, any real public debate about the consequences of what we're talking about. One of the major findings of the decision to attack the Iranian general, Soleimani, by the Trump administration, one of the factors involved was to try to take out somebody who had established international networks with cartels and other organized trafficking operations operating throughout Latin America, south of our border. These networks are real. These cooperative arrangements are real. Bottom line here, to listen to some of the candidates in this election, you would think they were oblivious to the reality of the national security threat associated with no southern border control. And naturally, the national media, so you get the truth here at FAIR. You don't get this stuff from most of the national media, of course, but the truth is this was a major advance in making us safer, because the General Soleimani had been very active for many, many, many years internationally in one way or another, trying to help undermine U.S. policy interests all across the globe. Arguably, one person can be a mastermind, can be just that smart, just that capable, just that conniving, just that evil. To hear the Democratic candidates talk about this now, you would think that they would have some kind of a strategy to deal with what we're talking about along the southern border. But they represent a political party which has decided since 2016 to stand in the way of everything that President Trump is trying to do along our borders and in the interior. Here at FAIR, we have been engaged in a day-to-day battle, along with our Law Institute, the Immigration Reform Law Institute, with which we share quarters here in the D.C. area, in an effort to both defend and enhance the Trump administration's policy agenda, its success in the courts, its success administratively, and I am extremely proud of the progress that we have made in 2019, 2018, and certainly hopefully that we can continue to make this continued progress in 2020. But we cannot do it without you. Now I want to bring you up to date on some of the policy issues that are going on here in Washington, okay? It is never quiet. Despite the fact that Congress has refused to provide President Trump the funding he wanted to build his wall, not once, not twice, but repeatedly, even during the first 2 years when the president had Republican control in Congress, they are more than willing to provide cheap labor, low-cost labor, predatory labor, in some cases shockingly unethical labor, to certain special interests, and I'm thinking right now in particular of agricultural interests, hotel, restaurant, and others, but particularly agriculture, because there's a bill in Congress now that passed the House called the Agriculture Modernization Workforce Act. It is a bad bill. It would create a form of indentured servitude. You see, over the years, FAIR has worked very hard to try to ensure the E-Verify program is implemented mandatorily nationally. That means that everybody who's hired has to be verified to make sure you have a right to be in the country and a right to work if you're here. Very simple. And E-Verify is a no-cost, low-burden program to help achieve exactly that. The Modernization Act in the House, this was passed by liberal Democrats also, and without them it wouldn't have passed, creates a long-term indenture that makes aliens work for 10 years for agricultural growers, 8 years at a time in order to get a green card, tethers them to the occupation, tethers them to the fields. This is contrary to the spirit of America and the whole idea behind what we mean when we talk about the American dream. Obviously, it also drives out American labor, which agriculture continues to maintain they can't get. Well, obviously they can't get if they're going to provide the kind of wages and working conditions they're talking about for these foreign workers. The agricultural community then made it clear what they were willing to what they had to have in order to get E-Verify mandatorily on agriculture. Keep in mind, in 1986, Congress, when it enacted employer sanctions, gave agriculture a very important concession. Before 1986, the Border Patrol could go on to an agricultural field, an open field, and check aliens' work eligibility and right to be in the country without a warrant. 1986, Congress imposed a warrant requirement because that's what agriculture wanted. And just like Meghan Markle, whatever agriculture wants, agriculture apparently gets. Now they're saying in order to actually entertain mandatory E-Verify for agricultural employers, they have to have this massive multi-million person amnesty/indentured servant guest worker program. Shocking that nominally liberal Democrats would go for something that would be so prejudicial to the interests of American workers, who frankly would be cheaper for Americans to actually subsidize American labor to go down and harvest these crops than continue this absurd strategy of providing a massive guest worker program, or in the alternative, illegal labor, which works for a few years in the fields and then goes off into the cities. Agriculture's big argument here is that, well, if you give them green cards, they're not going to stay on the farm. So they need to have a program that replicates illegal immigration under color of law. And that's what they're trying to get in legislation. And we are working very hard to try to push the administration to oppose a similar bill passing in the Senate, and it's something you want to keep an eye on. Another major bill could be coming up before the Senate. S386 is a bill, again, that's already passed the House that would lift the per country cap on aliens coming from certain higher skilled countries, India and China in particular. The H-1B program, which was enacted in 1990, was supposed to be designed for short-term, unforeseeable, emergent labor needs until employers could train American workers to do the job. We're talking 6 months. Now it's a multiple renewal, 12-year visa. It goes on forever. We have hundreds of thousands anyway of people here on these H-1Bs. And now the complaint is that the per-country caps that were put in place in the 1960s unfairly prejudice Indian and Chinese H-1B workers who now want to stay, of course, and want to bring all their family. And even though they were never promised by anybody that there was going to be a green card at the end of the rainbow if they come in here and take these jobs. I mean, not only have we lost technology transfer through these jobs, through these various programs, the program is not working in any way Congress ultimately intended. The H-1B program needs to be scrapped. But instead, there are some in Congress, particularly Mike Lee from Utah, and some others, but mostly Mike Lee, who's leading the charge in the Senate. They want to remove these per-country caps, which means that most of the occupational preferences would go to people from India and China for the foreseeable future. In our view, this is contrary to the spirit of having a reasonably limited number of immigrants coming in from a highly diverse set of countries around the world. We oppose this bill, and we think that you should too. Now, as I mentioned, the administration is maybe working on an alternative guest worker program for agriculture because the president really does want to see E-Verify implemented nationally, and he knows that without dairy farmers and big agriculture, who apparently are somewhat upset over the, say, China trade policy issues, feels he may need to mollify them. But that, again, is something we have to keep an eye on. Now, right now, we're also working on another front. FAIR has been pressuring DHA Secretary Wolf to not increase the number of H-2B visas. These are unskilled worker visas, and Congress gave the Secretary of Homeland Security authorization in his discretion to raise these numbers, double them really, to around 111, 12,000 from the current and usual 60-some thousand. We have sent a letter to Secretary Wolf and others that we are also working in Congress to try to get pressure to ask him not to increase these numbers. Look, wages are beginning to rise. Credit Laura Ingraham for an excellent interview where she really took it to Donald Trump and said, you promised it was going to be hiring American workers first. Donald Trump told her, well, under the Trump economy, which admittedly is good, there's going to be enough jobs for everybody and there's a labor shortage. He says, oh, these businesses are telling me there's a labor shortage. They're always talking about a labor shortage. We've heard this for years. There's no labor shortage. No such thing as cheap labor, just cheap employers. Laura Ingraham pointed this out. She said, Mr. President, where are the wage increases? If labor is so tight, Jeff Bezos needs to be peeling off a few Benjamins, okay, and sharing them with the rest of the folks working for him at Amazon. Where are the wage increases if you're really serious about there being that kind of labor shortage? Naturally, the president didn't really have an answer. He said, yeah, there have been some increases, but nothing like what there could be or should be. There is nothing wrong with a tight labor market. Nothing wrong with companies actually thinking in terms of their human assets as something to invest in, to grow, to retrain, to help move into the 21st century. Everybody knows how robotics and increased productivity through technology have been a threat to certain workers in our society. And there's an urgent need for businesses to think about how to put these folks back to work. It is a great opportunity to bring in folks who've been marginalized in the labor force back in to be productive citizens. It's all right there for the president to take as control of in this campaign and make the argument that his tightening of immigration, which, by the way, under President Trump has dropped, not hugely, but it has gone down, and it's gone down in part because they have tightened admissions standards. But the fact is, this is a great opportunity to show the benefits of tightening labor markets through responsible immigration controls. And he can run on that platform. Why let the businesses, multinationals, undermine the good times, okay? Let's let the good times roll. The old words of great R&B artist Louis Jordan, let the good times roll. Why do you want to start opening the spigot up to more foreign labor? But you need to know the White House is under enormous pressure from major multinationals, from big agriculture to increase immigration even as we speak. So you certainly want to weigh in with Secretary Wolf in opposition to the H-2B increases. We've talked a little bit about the candidates, and I want to mention about the fact that the Trump administration has given states the option of not resettling refugees. You probably know what's happening, right? Most states are immediately saying, sure, bring in more refugees. Now, why do they say that? Well, refugees are enormously expensive to resettle for lots of reasons. Many of them show up without English language ability, maybe they need remedial education, very high welfare dependency rates, certainly in the initial years. But the reasons they do is that there's big money in refugee resettlement. A lot of federal money provided to states and localities for refugee resettlement. For many of the depressed areas of the country, they see this as easy, fast money. Maybe Americans have been migrating out of those areas. They have a housing stock that's going vacant, and they think, well, we'll fill them up with refugees. Of course, the refugees aren't going to stay there in most of the case. They're going to go where the jobs are, but they do that. Now, there have been a few exceptions, okay? Texas, Governor Abbott announced last week they're not taking any refugees. And that's a very good thing, you know, because remember, admitting refugees is not mandatory. This is something we do at our discretion based on the national need and our humanitarian impulses. But under the Obama administration, communities were being taken advantage of. Communities were not being consulted about refugee admissions, and in the dead of night, they were bringing in people by the busload and settling them in communities without their consent. So credit President Trump with giving these communities consent. There have been some other counties, one in Minnesota in particular, that have said no refugees. Most governors, 14 I believe so far, have said, yeah, we want to continue taking refugees. Certainly most of the Democratic states have. But at least this administration is giving people an option while they reduce nationally the overall level of refugee admissions. You want to write the White House and tell them how much you appreciate how they've worked to reduce refugee admissions, because after all, under the asylum laws, we've taken hundreds of thousands of people from Central America and other countries, which are also humanitarian admissions. And we get no credit, both from the countries that send them, nor from international organizations, for the fact that we do have very high levels of humanitarian admissions, along with temporary protected status. And so there was a very strong argument for why we needed to reduce refugee admissions, costly as they are. By the way, there was an analysis done recently of the Democratic candidates and taking a look at their hometowns and how many people they have settled as refugees. And what they discovered is, lo and behold, very few of the hometowns that the various candidates are from have actually resettled refugees. Not surprising, I suppose, but we have a little bit of NIMBYism going on there among the Democratic candidates. The president has been doing a remarkable job negotiating bilateral agreements with Honduras and Guatemala. I mean, think about it. For years, and under the Obama administration, the idea was if you got physically to a U.S. border, you got in. By negotiating these safe country agreements and migration protection protocols, any alien who passes through Guatemala or Honduras or Mexico now can be returned back to those countries to make their asylum claim there. This was a brilliant maneuver, a fabulous breakthrough, and is producing massive deterrence for what we had there, that caravan crisis that we saw routinely earlier in the Trump administration and previous to that. So the Trump administration has scored a major victory with these bilateral agreements. Credit the president with doing everything he can with the tools he has without any cooperation, no cooperation whatsoever. What did the president get from the House? Well, the House passed the Mexican-Canadian trade agreement, and now they're delivering articles of impeachment over the next day or two. So he's really had to do this almost by himself. Mexico, too, has been tightening up its border controls and its interior enforcement with respect to Central Americans. None of this would have happened without strong, firm leadership from the White House, from the State Department, from this administration. FAIR has been working very hard to push for a long time a change to the public charge rules. Look, it is axiomatic for any society like ours, post-industrial superpower with a broad social safety net, that you can't have open borders. People don't have the right to just come into this country and get on welfare. And yet the rules were changed in the Clinton administration and certain court decisions before that effectively said, well, welfare doesn't really count. and the government has to make this elaborate demand for repayment, and nobody's ever going to do that, so in the end, it's not really enforced. Trump administration said, whoa, wait a minute, this is a major tool. Why do you want to admit people who lack the education, ability, and means to take care of themselves? Wouldn't it be better to admit people who have the productive capacity to contribute more than they cost to society? So he's implemented these public charge rules. Lo and behold, the ACLU went to court, and 2 federal courts enjoined these rules, and then a 3rd federal court enjoined them in New York City, New York State. Amazingly political decision. These courts issue these nationwide injunctions. Now, 2 of those courts have had these injunctions overturned by courts of appeal. But in the Second Circuit, in the New York court, that crazy injunction, politicized injunction from an Obama appointee, was upheld by an 3-judge Obama panel in the Second Circuit that upheld the public charge injunction. And just the other day, the Trump administration has now asked the Supreme Court to overturn the public charge injunctions and let it go into force. Now, why is that important? What it means is that it has a dramatic effect of reducing overall immigration. Okay, 25% of immigrants coming in these days don't have a high school degree. What does it mean? It means that an awful lot of people who are being approved for entry into the country and or getting green cards would not be because they lack the income earning ability to support themselves in our society. So it would have a major impact of reducing immigration. And it would, by consequence, move us more toward a merit-based immigration system, which many of us believe would make sense under a reasonable annual cap. Things that we've been pushing for a long time. Now we can talk about the wall for a minute. I know I'm covering a lot of topics, but you got to bear with me because there's a lot of good news. You don't hear anything, or you hear very little from the media about what's happening, but the Trump administration, in addition to pushing this public charge to the Supreme Court, fighting the ACLU and these other misguided organizations who've made it their business to find political judges to get these enjoined, the Trump administration is going to be successful because they're going to be persistent. They're going to be persistent, and we're going to be persistent in assisting them in this process. They need outside support. They need your support. They need fair support. Wall money. After fighting this battle for Congress, with Congress since he took office, the President has successfully won several court decisions that allow him to reprogram money from the defense budget to build a wall. Some of these military construction projects, some might be useful, some aren't. He's talking about $7 billion more. Jared Kushner has now been put in charge of building the wall. They say they've made their first 100 miles, and it's down there. And they want to try to get 300 to 400 miles by November of 2020. And, you know, by gum, I think he's going to do that. With $7 billion from that, plus the $1.6 billion that were finally appropriated by Congress, including Democrats, which makes the wall project bipartisan, if you can believe that. He's got at least a down payment on the building of a decent wall. You can go back to the voters and say, you know, I did everything I could to get this thing done, and there's a wall getting built. So you got to credit the president's persistence on this whole wall effort. Congressional Budget Office released a report the other day which had a key finding. They say that more people increases our aggregate gross domestic product. Now, it's not surprising. More people eat more hamburgers. More people buy clothes at Target. But they said it doesn't necessarily increase per capita GDP. In other words, it doesn't make each one of us individually wealthier. It may actually make each one of us poorer. Secondly, high levels of immigration can have an adverse effect on wages Americans earn. Obviously, axiomatic, but there it is. The CBO, Congressional Budget Office, has issued that core findings. Now, the Pew Research Organization has also come out with a report that says Democrats need to push the idea of income inequality. It's a real winner for them politically, more so than the immigration issue. Well, that would make sense because the Democrats' immigration policy positions are hugely unpopular in most parts of the country. But I think what they're saying, though, is ultimately that even the immigration control position is less popular than income inequality. As if somehow income inequality and mass immigration are unrelated. If anybody wants to understand income inequality, it would be impossible to not discuss the role of immigration in driving down and holding down wages and increasing income inequality in the aggregate throughout our society. So this is kind of a ridiculous report from Pew, which is highly politicized and nothing new. One of the things FAIR is constantly working on all through the states is trying to counter bad initiatives coming from usually Democrat-controlled jurisdictions, but not always. But it is remarkable how in these local communities you see how state legislators, local officials affiliated with the Democratic Party are alarmingly setting out on the same initiatives at the same time as if they're getting their marching orders from nonprofit organizations that are coordinating their messaging. I'm not going to say that's happening, but it's happening, just so you know. Now the Democrats who have decided that the word alien cannot even appear in the New York City Code and not even be mentioned unless you're talking about Star Wars, apparently. Forget about the word illegal alien, can't do that. They've just given driver's licenses and automatically register people to vote unless you affirmatively opt out of the voting registration process, with an eye toward turning a blind eye to vote fraud, obviously, because they're inviting it. And then secondly, we're now seeing initiatives for driver's licenses for illegal aliens in Idaho and Indiana. I know, you heard right, it's not your trick ear, okay? You don't have to clean out your ear. I said Idaho and Indiana. They're primarily Democrats, but in Idaho, it's again, this is agriculture pushing this idea. You know, all these years after 9/11, you see how we have such a short-term memory about the security threat associated with giving documents to people with no right to be in the country. But you have various political forces that are absolutely determined to make sure that we do not have federal cooperation, state and local and federal cooperation in immigration control. And certainly since the 2018 election, these efforts have been ramped up. So I want you to keep an eye on Idaho and Indiana because it's an area we're going to be fighting. We're going to be fighting these laws all throughout 2020. I do have some good news. The ACLU lost the case in California, a federal case where they were challenging the Trump administration's ability to separate parents from minor children under certain conditions, usually associated with criminal activity of the parents. And somehow, lo and behold, a federal judge was able to restrain himself from interfering by saying, I am reluctant to second guess the executive branch on an area that's committed to their discretion. You could have knocked me over with a feather. What a novel concept, an idea that a federal judge would actually defer to the executive branch in an area where historically the judiciary has deferred, involving border control and the management of aliens at our borders in what's called exclusion status or excludable aliens who have not been admitted. It's so, even though you see a lot of the news stories that suggest one setback after another, it is so important to realize the enormous progress we have made, we have made together in 2019 to advance the cause against a backdrop of some of the most rigorous, determined, and ideologically generated opposition to immigration controls and limits we've ever seen. Truly, our national future is at stake throughout 2020. The future is ours to control. The future can be ours for our children and grandchildren. And if we work together as one unit, work together as a national movement, FAIR and our allies and all of you, we can do great things throughout this year. And let's try to support those administration initiatives, credit President Trump for great, fierce determination, and not be afraid to speak up when we don't agree with what they're doing, but lend our hand and put our shoulder to the wheel when they come up with initiatives that we think are worthwhile. Working together, we can make 2020 the best year ever. Anyway, I will be back in touch with you soon. I appreciate all your questions and comments, and we will answer your questions that you post on this feed. I'm Dan Stein, president of FAIR, and I'll be back with you again shortly.